Dark greetings, I'm Anna Yudin and welcome to HALLOWEEK 2024. If you're not familiar with HALLOWEEK, once a year, the week of Halloween, I post only psychology of Halloween related topics. This year we're talking about actual ghost stories from Carl Jung's life, as well as the psychology of fairies. So in today's video, we're going to discuss some of Jung's most paranormal experiences in childhood as an adult with his clients, his research into mystical fields like alchemy and astrology, and his theory about what was behind all these paranormal experiences. Because when you have so many paranormal experiences, at some point you gotta start to wonder what is going on. If you don't know who Carl Jung is, he was a Swiss psychiatrist, one of the founding fathers of psychology. He was basically Freud's disciple, and later he kind of splintered off from Freud's train of thinking. But he had some really important contributions to psychology, like the collective unconscious, the idea of the shadow self, looking at mythology and analyzing works of fiction and art from a psychological point of view. So he was a fascinating man, and when you hear the kind of experiences he went through in his personal life, I think you'll kind of understand why he took the route he did in psychology. Starting with Jung's childhood experiences. Jung grew up in the Swiss countryside where he often had paranormal experiences. He spoke of dreams which foresaw the death of a certain person, clocks which stopped at the moment of death, glasses which shattered at the critical moment. At age 7, he saw an apparition during a time when his parents were separated. One night I saw coming from her door a faintly luminous, indefinite figure whose head detached itself from the neck and floated along in front of it. Now this is interesting because Jung noticed that these mystical experiences, these synchronicities as he called them, often tended to occur in periods of heightened emotionality. More on that in a second. Also very early on, Jung started to believe that he carried in him a second personality. He had personality number 1, which was little Carl Jung, and then he had personality number 2, which was a part of him he said felt ancient and wise and could be sometimes prone to bouts of anger. And it's very likely that him feeling fragmented in this way contributed to some of the early roots of parts theory, the idea that there are different parts within us, such as the persona and the shadow self that he later coined. He later also developed other personalities. There was one he called Philemon. This he called his ghostly guru, who conveyed insightful ideas to him. Jung's family had some pretty strange occurrences too. His maternal grandfather believed that he was surrounded by ghosts, and he devoted one day a week to talk to the spirit of his dead wife. He even had a special chair for her. Jung's maternal grandmother, his grandfather's second wife, had so many strange occurrences she had to keep a log to start tracking them. And Jung's cousin claimed to be a medium. She would host seances that Jung actually participated in. It appears that she was in love with Jung, and it's not quite clear, but there are some signs to suggest that it may have been reciprocal. Jung kind of downplayed his involvement in these seances, but he ended up writing his dissertation on them. So let's listen to him describe some of these seances. At home and from friends, she heard about table turning and began to take an interest in it. In July 1899, she did some table turning several times in the family circle with friends, but as a joke. It was then she discovered she was an excellent medium. The spirit gave himself out to be the grandfather of the medium. As I was acquainted with the family, I was able to take part in these experiments. At the beginning of August 1899, I witnessed the first attacks of somnambulism. Their course was usually as follows. S.W. grew very pale, slowly sank to the ground or into a chair, closed her eyes, became cataleptic, drew several deep breaths, and began to speak. At this stage, she was generally quite relaxed, the eyelid reflexes remained normal, and so did tactile sensibility. She was sensitive to unexpected touches and easily frightened, especially in the initial stage. She did not react when called by name. In her somnambulistic dialogue, she copied in a remarkably clever way her dead relatives and acquaintances with all their foibles. She flung herself into postures of prayer and rapture with staring eyes, and spoke with impassioned and glowing rhetoric. On these occasions, she made exclusive use of literary German, which she spoke with perfect ease and assurance, in complete contrast to her usual uncertain and embarrassed manner in the waking state. Now she would lie for 10 minutes to 2 hours on the sofa or the floor, motionless with closed eyes. Now she assumed a half-sitting posture and spoke with altered voice and diction. Now she was in constant movement, going through every possible pantomimic gesture. Sometimes she spoke in the first person, but never for long, and then only to prophesy her next attack. Sometimes, and this was most unusual, she spoke of herself in the third person. An almost constant feature was the sudden pallor, which gave her face a waxen, anemic hue that was positively frightening. Just before these attacks, she had strange sensations, became excited, rather anxious, and occasionally expressed thoughts of death, saying she would probably die in one of these attacks, that her soul only hung onto her body by a very thin thread, so that her body could scarcely go on living. He talked about how his cousin was very indignant if anyone suggested that she might be faking it. She truly seemed to believe that she was being possessed. And then there were a few ways that he described his cousin that made me wonder about possibly something of a sleep disorder or medical or mental disorder. For example, he said in the middle of a lively conversation, she would become all confused and go on talking senselessly in a peculiar monotonous way, looking in front of her dreamily with half-closed eyes. These lapses usually lasted only a few minutes, so here I was wondering maybe she's epileptic, maybe she was having a petit mal seizure. Other times he described how she had visions very often, and especially during attacks where she turned extremely pale, she wandered, or as she put it, lost her body and was wafted to distant places where the spirits led her. Here I was wondering maybe she was astrally projecting. I'm not going to comment on whether I think astral projection is real or if it's just mental, but in some sense of the word, that's what it sounds like she was doing. A little while after she had gone to bed, the room would suddenly light up, and shining white figures detached themselves from the foggy brightness. They were all wrapped in white veil-like robes. The women had things resembling turbans on their heads and wore girdles. Here I wondered, okay, maybe she has some sort of night terrors, maybe some sleep paralysis. Then he went on, finally she saw the figures in broad daylight, though only blurred and fleetingly. I wondered also about narcolepsy. I wondered also about maybe some form of psychosis. Obviously, we will never know. This person lived a long time ago, but I think it's interesting to speculate on how these paranormal experiences back then might be diagnosed today. Now, at age 23, Jung had a strange experience where a round walnut table in his home broke very suddenly and for no reason with a loud bang. And 2 weeks later, there was another loud sound, revealed to be a steel knife in perfect condition that had shattered into 4 parts in a closed drawer. Let's hear Jung describe it. One day I was sitting in my room studying my textbooks. Suddenly there sounded a report like a pistol shot. I jumped up and rushed into the room from which the noise of the explosion had come. My mother was sitting flabbergasted in her armchair, the knitting falling from her hands. She stammered out, "What's happened?" It was right beside me, and stared at the table. Following her eyes, I saw what had happened. The tabletop had split from the rim to beyond the center, and not along any joint. The split ran through the solid wood. I was thunderstruck. How could such a thing happen? A table of solid walnut that had dried out for 70 years. How could it split on a summer day in the relatively high degree of humidity characteristic of our climate? Some 2 weeks later, I came home at 6 o'clock in the evening and found the household, my mother, my 14-year-old sister, and the maid, in a great state of agitation. About an hour earlier, there had been another deafening report. This time it was not the already damaged table. The noise had come from the direction of the sideboard, a heavy piece of furniture dating from the early 19th century. They had already looked all over it, but found no trace of a split. Then I began on the interior of the sideboard. In the cupboard containing the bread basket, I found a loaf of bread, and beside it the bread knife. The greater part of the blade had snapped off in several places. The next day I took the shattered knife to one of the best cutlers in town. He examined the fractures with a magnifying glass and shook his head. "This knife is perfectly sound," he said. "There is no fault in the steel. Someone must have deliberately broken it piece by piece. It could be done, for instance, by sticking the blade into the crack of the drawer and breaking off a piece at a time, or else it might have been dropped on stone from a great height. But good steel can't explode. Someone has been pulling your leg." Now, like I mentioned, Jung was friends with Freud. He was kind of like a son figure to him. Freud was the father of psychology, and he liked to surround himself with younger psychologists and psychiatrists who looked up to him and revered his theories. For a while, that was Jung. In fact, Jung was his golden child. However, that changed when Jung started to diverge in his theories compared to Freud, where he started to doubt that everything related to the drive for sexuality, like Freud theorized, and when he started to look at more mystical matters from a psychological perspective. Now, one time, Jung and Freud were arguing about some paranormal phenomenon. And at the time that this happened, a loud sound went off in Freud's bookcase. Freud dismissed Jung's parapsychological explanation, while Jung predicted another one would happen, and so it did. At that moment, there was such a loud report in the bookcase, which stood right next to us, that we both started up in alarm, fearing the thing was going to topple over on us. I said to Freud, "There, that is an example of a so-called catalytic exteriorization phenomenon." "Oh, come," he exclaimed, "that is sheer bosh." "It is not," I replied. "You are mistaken, Herr Professor. And to prove my point, I now predict that in a moment there will be another loud report." Sure enough, no sooner had I said the words than the same detonation went off in the bookcase. To this day, I do not know what gave me this certainty, but I knew beyond all doubt that the report would come again. Freud only stared aghast at me. I do not know what was in his mind or what his look meant. In any case, this incident aroused his mistrust of me, and I had the feeling that I had done something against him. I never afterwards discussed the incident with him. This incident really marked kind of a symbolic rift between the two men. It started what ultimately became the estrangement of their symbolic father-son relationship. Now, on one occasion, Freud spoke about how Philemon, one of his personalities, appeared in his dream with kingfisher's wings. Jung decided to make a painting of the dream to better understand it. He was doing so in his garden, and at the time that he did so, a dead kingfisher appeared next to him in the garden. In 1916, Jung wrote a series of texts addressed to the spirits of the dead compelled by Philemon. And during that time, his house experienced a haunting. It began with a restlessness, but I did not know what it meant or what they wanted of me. There was an ominous atmosphere all around me. I had the strange feeling that the air was filled with ghostly entities. Then it was as if my house began to be haunted. My eldest daughter saw a white figure passing through the room. My second daughter, independently of her elder sister, related that twice in the night her blanket had been snatched away, and that same night my 9-year-old son had an anxiety dream. In the morning he asked his mother for crayons, and he, who ordinarily never drew, now made a picture of his dream. He called it the picture of the fisherman. Around 5 o'clock in the afternoon on Sunday, the front door bell began ringing frantically. It was a bright summer day. The two maids were in the kitchen, from which the open square outside the front door could be seen. Everyone immediately looked to see who was there, but there was no one in sight. Now, let's talk about perhaps my favorite paranormal experience of Jung's. When he was staying in London for a conference one time, he realized he was staying in a haunted house, and he had some very strange experiences. In the summer of 1920, I went to London. My colleague told me that, in expectation of my visit, he had found a suitable weekend place for the summer. This, he said, had not been so easy because everything had already been let for the summer holidays, or else was so exorbitantly expensive or unattractive that he had almost given up hope. But finally, by a lucky chance, he had found a charming cottage that was just right for us and at a ridiculously low price. That first night, tired from the strenuous work of the week, I slept well. We spent the next day walking and talking. That evening, feeling rather tired, I went to bed at 11 o'clock, but did not get beyond the point of drowsing. I only fell into a kind of torpor, which was unpleasant because I felt I was unable to move. Again, I wonder about sleep paralysis. Maybe it runs in his family. Also, it seemed to me that the air had become stuffy and that there was an indefinable, nasty smell in the room. I thought I had forgotten to open the windows. Finally, in spite of my torpor, I was driven to light a candle. Both windows were open, and a night wind blew softly through the room, filling it with the flowery scents of high summer. There was no trace of the bad smell. I remained half awake in my peculiar condition until I glimpsed the first pale light of dawn through the east window. At this moment, the torpor dropped away from me like magic, and I fell into a deep sleep. On Sunday evening, I mentioned in passing to Dr. X that I had slept remarkably badly the night before. He recommended me to drink a bottle of beer, which I did. But when I went to bed, the same thing happened. I could not get beyond the point of drowsing. Both windows were open. The air was fresh to begin with, but after about half an hour, it seemed to turn bad. It had become stale and fuggy, and finally somehow repulsive. It was hard to identify the smell. Suddenly I hit on the memory of an old woman who was suffering from an open carcinoma. This was quite unmistakably the same sickly smell I had so often noticed in her room. As a psychologist, I wondered what might be the cause of this peculiar olfactory hallucination, but I was unable to discover any convincing connection between it and my present state of consciousness. In the end, I could not think any more and fell into a torpid doze. Suddenly I heard the noise of water dripping. Didn't I turn off the tap properly, I thought? But of course there's no water in the room, so it's obviously raining, yet today was so fine. Meanwhile, the dripping went on regularly, 1 drop every 2 seconds. The roof must be leaking, I thought. Finally, with a heroic effort, so it seemed to me, I lit the candle and went over to the chest of drawers. There was no water on the floor and no damp spot on the plaster ceiling. Only then did I look out of the window. It was a clear, starry night. The dripping still continued. I could make out a place on the floor about 18 inches from the chest of drawers where the sound came from. I could have touched it with my hand. All at once, the dripping stopped and did not come back. Towards 3 o'clock, at the first light of dawn, I fell into a deep sleep. No, I have heard death watch beetles. The ticking noise they make is sharper. This was a duller sound, exactly what would be made by drops of water falling from the ceiling. I was so annoyed with myself and not exactly refreshed by this weekend, but I said nothing to Dr. X. The next weekend, after a busy and eventful week, I did not think at all about my previous experience. Yet hardly had I been in bed for half an hour that everything was there as before. The torpor, the repulsive smell, the dripping. And this time there was something else. Something brushed along the walls. The furniture creaked now here and there. There were rustlings in the corners. A strange restlessness was in the air. I thought it was the wind, lit the candle, and went to shut the windows. But the night was still. There was no breath of wind. So long as the light was on, the air was fresh and no noise could be heard. But the moment I blew out the candle, the torpor slowly returned. The air became foggy, and the creakings and rustlings began again. I thought I must have noises in my ear, but at 3 o'clock in the morning they stopped as promptly as before. The third night, it was even worse. There were loud knocking noises, and I had the impression that an animal about the size of a dog was rushing around the room in a panic. As usual, the hubbub stopped abruptly with the first streak of light in the east. The phenomena grew still more intense during the following weekend. The rustling became a fearful racket, like the roaring of a storm. Sounds of knocking came also from outside in the form of dull blows, as though somebody were banging on the brick walls with a muffled hammer. Several times I had to assure myself that there was no storm and that nobody was banging on the walls from outside. The next weekend, the 4th, I cautiously suggested to my host that the house might be haunted. Naturally, he laughed at me, although he was as much at a loss as I about my insomnia. It also struck me how quickly the 2 girls cleared away after dinner every evening, and always left the house long before sundown. I jokingly remarked to the girl who did the cooking that she must be afraid of us if she had herself fetched every evening by her friend and was then in such a hurry to get home. She laughed and said that she wasn't at all afraid of the gentleman, but that nothing would induce her to stay a moment in this house alone, and certainly not after sunset. Why, what's the matter with it? I asked. Why, it's haunted, didn't you know? That's the reason why it was going so cheap. My host was skeptical, but he was willing to give the house a thorough looking over. We found nothing remarkable until we came to the attic. There, between the 2 wings of the house, we discovered a dividing wall, and in it a comparatively new door, about half an inch thick, with a heavy lock and 2 huge bolts that shut off our wing from the unoccupied part. The girls did not know of the existence of this door. It presented something of a puzzle, because the 2 wings communicated with one another, both on the ground floor and on the first floor. There were no rooms in the attic to be shut off, and no signs of use. The purpose of the door seemed inexplicable. The 5th weekend was so unbearable that I asked my host to give me another room. This is what happened. It was a beautiful moonlit night, with no wind. In the room there were rustlings, creakings, and bangings. From outside, blows rained on the walls. I had the feeling there was something near me, and I opened my eyes. There beside me on the pillow, I saw the head of an old woman, and the right eye, wide open, glared at me. The left half of the face was missing below the eye. I leapt out of bed with one bound, lit the candle, and spent the rest of the night in an armchair. I challenged Dr. X to try sleeping in the haunted room himself. He agreed to this. Next morning I left. 10 days later, I had a letter from Dr. X. He had spent the weekend alone in the cottage. So he set up his camp in the conservatory, and as the cottage really was rather lonely, he took a loaded shotgun to bed with him. Everything was deathly still. He did not feel altogether at ease, but nevertheless almost succeeded in falling asleep after a time. Suddenly it seemed to him that he heard footsteps in the corridor. He immediately struck a light and flung open the window, but there was nothing to be seen. He went back grumpily to bed, thinking I had been a fool. But it was not long before he again heard footsteps, and to his discomfiture he discovered that the door lacked a key. He rammed a chair against the door with its back under the lock and returned to bed. Soon afterwards, he again heard footsteps, which stopped just in front of the door. The chair creaked as though somebody was pushing against the door from the other side. He then set up his bed in the garden, and there he slept very well. A little later, I heard from Dr. X that the owner had the cottage pulled down since it was unsaleable and scared away all tenants. I mean, what else would you call that but a ghost story? Jung also had experiences where he foretold the death of somebody he knew. I recall one time during the Second World War when I was returning home from Bollingen. I had a book with me but could not read, for the moment the train started to move, I was overpowered by the image of someone drowning. This was a memory of an accident that had happened while I was on military service. During the entire journey, I could not rid myself of it. I got out at Erlenbach and walked home, still troubled by this memory. My second daughter's children were in the garden. The family was living with us, having returned to Switzerland from Paris because of the war. The children stood looking rather upset, and when I asked, "Why, what is the matter?" they told me that Adrian, then the youngest of the boys, had fallen into the water in the boathouse. It is quite deep there, and since he could not really swim, he had almost drowned. His older brother had fished him out. This had taken place at exactly the time I had been assailed by the memory in the train. Jung also had a disturbing dream leading up to World War I that he later interpreted was foretelling World War I. Towards the autumn of 1913, the pressure which I had felt in me seemed to be moving outwards, as though there was something in the air. The atmosphere actually seemed to me darker than it had been. In October, while I was alone on a journey, I was suddenly seized by an overpowering vision. I saw a monstrous flood covering all the northern and low-lying lands between the North Sea and the Alps. When it came up to Switzerland, I saw that the mountains grew higher and higher to protect our country. I realized that a frightful catastrophe was in progress. I saw the mighty yellow waves, the floating rubble of civilization, and the drowned bodies of uncounted thousands. Then the whole sea turned to blood. This vision lasted about 1 hour. On August 1st, the World War broke out. In 1944, Jung experienced a heart attack and he had a near-death experience. This near-death experience gave him an altered state of consciousness and a lot of mystical insight that he actually brought forward in his career. For instance, it was that heart attack that made him realize he wanted to change the way he wrote books, and he wrote for the first time a book for the masses rather than for clinicians. At the beginning of 1944, I broke my foot, and this misadventure was followed by a heart attack. In a state of unconsciousness, I experienced deliriums and visions which must have begun when I hung on the edge of death and was being given oxygen and camphor injections. The images were so tremendous that I myself concluded that I was close to death. My nurse afterwards told me it was as if you were surrounded by a bright glow. That was a phenomenon she had sometimes observed in the dying, she added. I had reached the outermost limit and do not know whether I was in a dream or in ecstasy. At any rate, extremely strange things began happening to me. It seemed to me that I was high up in space. Far below, I saw the globe of the Earth bathed in a gloriously blue light. I knew that I was on the point of departing from the Earth. A short distance away, I saw in space a tremendous dark block of stone like a meteorite. It was floating in space, and I myself was floating in space. But perhaps the strangest thing about his near-death experience was that he had a prophetic vision about his doctor. From below, from the direction of Europe, an image floated up. It was my doctor, Dr. H, or rather his likeness, framed by a golden chain or a golden laurel wreath. I knew at once, aha, this is my doctor, of course, the one who's been treating me. But now he is coming in his primal form, as a Basileus of Kos. He was into archetypes and legends and mythology. It's not important. In life, he was an avatar of this Basileus, the temporal embodiment of the primal form, which has existed from the beginning. Now he is appearing in that primal form. As he stood before me, a mute exchange of thought took place between us. Dr. H had been delegated by the earth to deliver a message to me, to tell me that there was a protest against my going away. I had no right to leave the earth and must return. The moment I heard that, the vision ceased. A good 3 weeks were still to pass before I could truly make up my mind to live again. I felt violent resistance to my doctor because he had brought me back to life. At the same time, I was worried about him. His life is in danger, for heaven's sake. He has appeared to me in his primal form. When anyone attains this form, it means he's going to die, for already he belongs to the greater company. Suddenly, the terrifying thought came to me that Dr. H would have to die in my stead. I tried my best to talk to him about it, but he did not understand me. Then I became angry with him. Why does he always pretend he doesn't know he is a Basileus of Kos, and that he has already assumed this primal form? He wants to make me believe that he doesn't know. That irritated me. My wife reproved me for being so unfriendly to him. She was right, but at the time I was angry with him for stubbornly refusing to speak of all that had passed between us in my vision. In actual fact, I was his last patient. On April 4, 1944, I still remember the exact date, I was allowed to sit up on the edge of my bed for the very first time since the beginning of my illness, and on the same day Dr. H took to his bed and did not leave it again. I heard he was having intermittent attacks of fever. Soon afterwards, he died of septicemia. Call it the ramblings of a man who had just experienced a near-death experience, but it is quite the synchronicity. Here's one more thing that Jung said about near-death experiences and the experience of death. What happens after death is so unspeakably glorious that our imagination and our feelings do not suffice to form even an approximate conception of it. The dissolution of our time-bound form in eternity brings no loss of meaning. Rather does the little finger know itself a member of the hand. The individual consciousness is melting back into the collective consciousness. Like I said, Jung also had some pretty interesting experiences with his analysins, with the patients he was treating. One time, a skeptical woman was telling Jung about a dream in which she had been given an expensive jewel in the shape of a scarab beetle. And at that very moment, when she was saying this, an insect started tapping on the window of his office. And that synchronicity, how powerful it was ultimately what allowed the woman to break her resistance to treatment and for treatment to continue more therapeutically. Let's hear it in Jung's words. She had an impressive dream the night before, in which someone had given her a golden scarab, a costly piece of jewelry. While she was telling me this dream, I heard something behind me gently tapping on the window. I turned round and saw that it was a fairly large flying insect that was knocking against the window pane from outside in the obvious effort to get in the dark room. This seemed to me very strange. I opened the window immediately and caught the insect in the air as it flew in. It was a scarabid beetle, or common rosechafer, whose gold-green color most nearly resembles that of a golden scarab. I handed the beetle to my patient with the words, "Here is your scarab." The experience punctured the desired hole in her rationalism and broke the ice of her intellectual resistance. This is interesting because remember how I said Jung noticed synchronicities often happen during periods of heightened emotionality. He thought that synchronicities occur at key points in a person's life to help the process of individuation. Individuation was a lifelong process that he saw as basically us coming to terms with ourselves, our self-development, never-ending, constant process. Here's another unfortunate case of Jung predicting the death of someone. At about 2 o'clock, I must have just fallen asleep. I awoke with a start and had the feeling that someone had come into the room. I even had the impression that the door had been hastily opened. I instantly turned on the light, but there was nothing. Someone might have mistaken the door, I thought, and looked into the corridor. But it was still as death. Odd, I thought. Someone did come into the room. Then I tried to recall exactly what had happened, and it occurred to me that I had been awakened by a feeling of dull pain, as though something had struck my forehead and then the back of my skull. The following day I received a telegram saying that my patient had committed suicide. He had shot himself. Later I learned that the bullet had come to rest in the back of his skull. So all of these paranormal experiences led Jung to have a particular interest in mystical traditions. About astrology, he said, "I dare say that one day we shall find in astrology a good deal of knowledge that has been intuitively projected into the heavens." He would sometimes use horoscopes to gain insight on tricky cases, and he thought that astrology really boiled down to the fact that certain moments in time hold certain qualities. Not necessarily to do with the stars per se, but rather what we project onto the heavens during certain times. It is not the apparent positions of the stars which work, but rather the times which are measured or determined by arbitrarily named stellar positions. Time thus proves to be a stream of energy filled with qualities. Jung even did an astrological experiment on married couples, though not with the traditional statistical methods. He didn't expect it to be statistically significant because synchronicities don't work that way. Jung also did some research on the Chinese I Ching. He was impressed with its accuracy in answering his questions. He said the science of the I Ching is based not on the causality principle, but on one which hitherto unnamed because not familiar to us, I have tentatively called the synchronistic principle. Here we hear some of the very first seeds of his theory of the synchronicity. Like Like I said, he was also into alchemy. He looked at medieval and Renaissance theories of correspondences and alchemical understanding of the unus mundus, the idea of one world and the relationship between the microcosm and the macrocosm, providing acausal connections between events. He was also peripherally involved in parapsychology. In 1932, J.B. Rhine was running a parapsychology lab at Duke that basically gave scientific support for the theories of extrasensory perception and psychokinesis, basically reading people's minds and communicating without speaking. And Jung concluded that in relation to the psyche, space and time are, so to speak, elastic and can apparently be reduced almost to a vanishing point. He called it the relativity of time and space, reminiscent of Einstein's theories of relativity. He said that knowledge of events at a distance is possible because in the unconscious psyche, all events coexist timelessly and spacelessly. So I could be predicting what you are thinking far away because of the unconscious, where all things co-occur at once. He was also involved in quantum physics, specifically with physicist Wolfgang Pauli. Pauli had some pretty strange synchronicities himself in life. Every time he would get near one of his equipment pieces, it would instantly break, and he coined this the Pauli effect as a joke, but later it did also inspire a physics theory called the Pauli exclusion principle, which states that no two fermions can simultaneously occupy the same quantum space. Jung helped Pauli psychoanalyze his dreams, and Pauli helped Jung polish up the concept of synchronicity. But years after Pauli coined the Pauli effect, two of Pauli's scientist friends were tinkering with some equipment. When one of them exploded, for no particular reason, they smiled to each other and they said, "Oh, Pauli must be nearby, because of the Pauli effect." And later they learned that exactly at that time, Pauli was actually passing through their city in a train. Also, his whole life, Pauli was obsessed with something called the fine structure consonant, which had a value of approximately 1 out of 137. And near the end of his life, when he fell ill with pancreatic cancer, Pauli called a friend to visit him in the hospital. And he said, "Look at the door." The number on his door was 137. So these synchronicities didn't just happen to Jung, they also happened to the people around him. Now, he had kind of an interesting theory on UFOs that I'll share briefly. It seems to me that there is a third possibility, that UFOs are real material phenomena of an unknown nature, presumably coming from outer space, which perhaps have long been visible to mankind, but otherwise have no recognizable connection with the Earth or its inhabitants. In recent times, however, and just at the moment when the eyes of mankind are turned towards the heavens, partly on account of their fantasies about possible spaceships, and partly in a figurative sense because of their earthly existence being threatened, unconscious contents have projected themselves on these inexplicable heavenly phenomenon and given them a significance they in no way deserve. It seems like what he was suggesting here was that in the wake of World War II, during the Cold War, people were scared. They were looking towards the heavens and wanting an escape because they knew there could be nuclear destruction at any given moment. And they started to project these fantasies and desires onto objects in the sky that had always been there, but they had only now started to notice. It's an interesting theory. Let me know what you think about it. So what did Jung think explained all of these paranormal experiences? It boils down to what he called synchronicity. A synchronicity is basically a meaningful coincidence. It's something that seems like it could be coincidental, but is so meaningful to you that it just kind of defies chance. They cannot be related causally, meaning one did not cause the other, but rather Jung theorized that they must be connected by something else. He thought that under certain conditions, time and space could both become relative and be transcended altogether. And he actually added synchronicity as a fourth explanatory principle in addition to time, space, and causality. So he said there are largely three types of synchronicity. One is when a psychic event and a physical event occur at the same time and place. For example, his patient who had had a dream about a scarab beetle and was telling that dream at the exact same time that a scarab beetle was trying to enter his office. Type number 2 of synchronicity is when there's a psychic event corresponding with a physical event at the same time but at a little bit of a distance, so that the approximate simultaneity is only later established, such as when Pauli came into town in a train, and that was the exact moment that his friend's equipment blew up, which was meaningful because of the Pauli effect. And the third type of synchronicity is a psychic event occurs, and then later on a corresponding physical event takes place, such as you experience a dream about somebody passing away, and later it comes to fruition. At the time that Jung was coming up with this theory, acausality was starting to become well known in quantum mechanics, and he thought if acausality can be something that happens on the micro, why can't it also be something that happens on the macro? And he said that synchronicity really hinges on the meaning that you make of it. For instance, if a beetle were to start beating against my window now, it wouldn't mean anything to me because I didn't have a dream about a beetle. The meaning of the synchronicity lies in the experiences of the people living it. I've certainly had some pretty crazy synchronicities in my own life. I won't talk about them today because, frankly, I don't think you'd believe me. That's how kind of outlandish they are. But I'd be really, really curious if you have any of your own and what you think about the theory of synchronicity and what you think about everything that I've relayed in this video. I hope that this was a fun topic for HALLOWEEK this year and that it provided just one perspective on paranormal experiences. And again, if you want to give me a HALLOWEEK present, the best present ever would be to comment down your own paranormal experiences, synchronicities, or your own thoughts. I hope you have a spooky rest of the week, and I will see you soon when we talk about the psychology of fairies.